These are 10 commons that broke draft. Now, every card has to be evaluated in the context of its particular format, but these cards were superstars in their formats, even though they were just commons, and they have become the stuff of legend. It's not only fun to look at them for a bit of a history lesson, but also to help understand what makes a card super powerful, so that going forward, it's easier to identify them in future sets. First up, we have Sparksmith from Onslaught. For 1 and a red, you get a 1/1 goblin that says, tap, Sparksmith deals X damage to target creature and X damage to you, where X is the number of goblins in play. So back in the day, creatures were a lot smaller, so dealing 1 or 2 damage would take out so many creatures. So getting Sparksmith plus any number of other goblins in play, all of a sudden you just have a card that's killing one of your opponent's creatures every single turn, and it's just absolutely decimating your opponent. Sure, you're taking some damage in the process, but you're definitely willing to take some damage in exchange for killing your opponent's creatures. And Sparksmith, if it didn't die, was just mowing down your opponent's creatures and was absolutely devastating in its format. Next up is Renegade Freighter from the original Kaladesh. This is 3 mana for a 4/3 vehicle. This was the first format that had vehicles, and they definitely pushed this one. It has a crew cost of 2, and whenever Renegade Freighter attacks, it gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So just a colorless 3 mana, basically 5/4 attacker, was just absolutely devastating. It was so hard to beat this card when it came down on turn 3, and it's colorless, so like every deck has access to it. It's definitely a very pushed card because it's just so much stats coming at you so quickly. Creatures were a little bit smaller in general back in Kaladesh, so a 5/4 attacking on turn 4, while large today was a little bit even bigger back then. When this came out in like 2016, and just an absolutely devastating card, really pushed. And when they brought back Kaladesh Remastered onto MTG Arena, they didn't even put Renegade Freighter in the set because it was so format warping. Next up is Pestilence, which is a card that was printed in Alpha, but then was reprinted several times at Common in formats that were actually designed with Draft in mind, including things like Urza Saga, which this artwork comes from. Pestilence is 2 black for an enchantment, and says at the beginning of each turn, if no creatures are in play, sacrifice Pestilence, and then pay black. Pestilence deals 1 damage to each creature and player. So if you have like a reasonably sized creature in play, you just have so much control over destroying any small creatures, because you can just deal 2 to everything however many times you want, like every single turn if need be, if your opponent's just playing a few small creatures. Remember that back in the day, creatures in general were smaller, so dealing like 1 or 2 would take out a decent number of creatures, dealing 3 would take out a big number of creatures. And so if you had like something with 4 toughness, like even a 0/4 or something like that, Pestilence could just be the sort of card that made sure your opponents could never really get anything going, get anything into play. And if your life total was higher than your opponent's, it could also be a win condition, because you can just deal a couple damage to each player every turn, and then Pestilence eventually wins you the game. And all of this, of course, at Common, which all of these cards are commons, but just having so much board control for a card at Common is just kind of wild, and Pestilence is definitely one of those cards that just absolutely trumped board states and was super strong. Next up is Serulf's Packmate, getting a little bit more modern here with Call Time. Serulf's Packmate is 3 and a green for a 3/3 wolf. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, and then it has Foretell for 1 and a green. So that means that you can cast it for Foretell and then pay 2 generic mana later to cast it. So Serulf's Packmate, just one of those creatures that whenever your opponent played it, it was a sizable body. A 3/3 is still a really good body. And the fact that you could cast like the Foretell on turn 2, on turn 3 you'd have a 3/3 that drew you a card. That was a pretty common play pattern. If you ever top deck this in the late game, you just get a 3/3 that drew you a card. That's a really good rate. And overall, Serulf's Packmate, the fact that it had such flexibility with how you could use it in your curve because of that Foretell ability, and the fact that you're getting a good body with a 2-for-1 when you play this, meant that this was just a card that was really annoying to deal with, and always put you in a substantially better position whenever you played it, and ended up winning you a lot of games as a result. And the next couple of cards are similar in this vein. Organ Hoarder came out a couple sets later in Midnight Hunt. For 3 in the blue, it's a 3/2 zombie. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put 1 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. And so Serulf's Packmate had an extra point of toughness, but didn't have the card selection mode of this, and this thing also doesn't have the Foretell. But the thing about Organ Hoarder was that it was in a set where the graveyard also mattered, and so you could oftentimes end up with situations where you would look at the top 3 cards of your library, you could grab a card that you wanted, and then you would put another couple cards in your graveyard, and maybe one of those cards would be a card that you could cast from your graveyard or use from your graveyard in some way. So Organ Hoarder would be drawing you like 1.5 cards in those cases. And it was just such a dominant 4-drop because any time, like a 3/2 is going to trade with a relevant card from the opponent. And so it's just like a clean 2 for one that's just like really hard to deal with. And so because it's a common, you just play against decks that have like 2 or 3 Organ Hoarders, and then your deck that just doesn't have access to it because maybe you're not playing blue is just getting crushed. And so these 2-for-1 common creatures were kind of a theme of several sets, not like literally in a row, but kind of like sequentially coming up. Organ Hoarder, Serol's Packmate were really strong cards, and the third card in this sequence was Inspiring Overseer, which was 2 and a white, 2/1 Angel Cleric with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card, and this common just absolutely dominated in Streets of New Capenna. It just made any deck that wasn't playing white feel like it was just at a disadvantage when you didn't have access to Inspiring Overseer. Just a 2/1 flyer is just like an okay stat line, but the fact that it gains you a life and draws a card is just really hard to deal with, especially because white cares about the evasion. It wants to be an aggressive color in many cases, and so just being able to like attack your opponent with your 2/1 flyer, it even gains you a life, it drew you a card. It's just fueling your engines and everything by just greasing the wheels, gets you another card, gets you deeper in your deck, finds you more things you can do, and is also just attacking pretty reasonably as a 2-powered flyer for 3 mana. This card was absolutely fantastic and was just one of the best cards in the set regardless of rarity, and Inspiring Overseer definitely one of those 2-for-1 creatures that just absolutely messes up formats sometimes by being super strong at such a low rarity, the lowest of rarities common. Next up is Rolling Thunder. We're going back to Tempest for a card that was just absolutely devastating on the board states when creatures were much smaller. For X red, it's a sorcery. Rolling Thunder deals X damage divided any way you choose among any number of target creatures and or players. So if you're casting this for like X equals 4, you can kill a couple of 2/2 creatures. But back in the day, games were slower because creatures were smaller. So when your opponent's hitting you, they're not hitting you for like 4 or 5 a turn. Like with a bigger creature that you would find these days, the creatures would be like 3-powered instead. So you have a little bit more time, so you're getting to bigger X values, and that means that not only does it line up better against the creatures because the creatures have lower toughness, but because those creatures also have lower power, you have more time to get a higher number of lands in play to cast this for a higher X value, kill more creatures, and eventually you can also just use this to finish off the game. If your opponent's at 6 life and you can get to 8 mana, you can target any number of creatures and or players, so you can deal 6 to your opponent if you want. Rolling Thunder, just an absolutely devastating kind of one-sided board wipe in many cases in Tempest, and Tempest actually has 2 really game-breaking commons to discuss. Capsize is also really strong. 1 blue for an instant with buyback, which means you can pay 3 mana. The buyback cost is 3. You can pay an additional 3 when you play it. If you do put it into your hand instead of your graveyard as part of the spell's effect, return target permanent to its owner's hand. So Capsize, bouncing something, and then you can buy it back for 6 mana. 6 mana, bounce something and get the bounce spell back might not seem crazy, but then you just imagine a board state where you're just slightly ahead. You maybe have a little bit of an advantage on the board state. You bounce your opponent's biggest creature, and then all of a sudden you're attacking them, say, and then they just can never really redeploy that creature, because if they would redeploy that creature, their big creature, maybe they spend 5 mana on it, you just bounce it back to their hand and then just keep attacking them. So they then end up in a spot where it's like, okay, how am I going to deal with Capsize? Well, I guess if I can play a creature and then kill my own creature in response to the Capsize, I can like fizzle it, but that's like going to put them down a ton of stuff anyway. Your Capsize is just doing so much work, and also you don't like have to cast it every single turn, just the threat of being able to bounce something big. So maybe your opponent plays a couple smaller creatures instead, so you take the time to deploy your big creatures, and then they can still never really deploy their big creature, because anytime they tap all of their mana to play something big, you just bounce it back to their hand, and then just, if you're in a decent board state, you're going to just be absolutely crushing them. It can also return any permanent, so if you get like too far ahead, you can just start bouncing their lands. If they've been like mana, like stuck on lands for a while, that's not really going to happen in limited, really, because by the time you get to 6 mana, they're usually either going to be already have lost because they haven't hit their land drops or whatever. But the fact that you can return any permanents is definitely relevant. You can bounce things that aren't creatures that might be having an effect on the game. And overall, Capsize is just one of those cards that takes over the game in very obvious ways once you're actually playing with it, because again, the creatures, if you're just even slightly ahead on board and you're playing like clunkier creatures or whatever, like the more expensive the creatures they are playing, the more devastating it is to just bounce them back to their hand over and over and over. And Capsize is definitely a stellar common. Next up, we're going a lot more recent with Writhing Chrysalis from Modern Horizons 3. It's 2 red-green for a 2/3 Eldrazi drone. It has Devoid. When you cast this spell, create 2 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature, add colorless mana. It has reach, and whenever you sacrifice another Eldrazi, put a +1/+1 counter on Writhing Chrysalis. So on its own, you get a 2/3 and 2 0/1s that you can sacrifice for mana. When you do sacrifice them, your Writhing Chrysalis gets bigger. So you play this on turn 4. On turn 5, if you make your land drop, you have access to 7 mana. And you're going to generally have, after you've sacrificed those Eldrazi's, a 4/5 that you also have, in addition to having cast 7 mana worth of spells on turn 5. There's also tons of other cards in the set in red, green, and even in blue, which you would often kind of play these teamer decks where they would generate Eldrazi spawn tokens, so Writhing Chrysalis was going to end up much bigger than just a 4 or 5. It could be a 6-7 relatively easily if you play one Writhing Chrysalis and then play another Writhing Chrysalis. Remember, it's a common, so you do see multiple copies of these sometimes. You end up with just a bunch of giant creatures that also have reach, so your opponent can't even like attack past them, and if your opponent does kill the Writhing Chrysalis, you still got generally a pretty decent advantage out of it because you got the 2/0/1s that let you ramp into something else that was pretty big and problematic for your opponent to deal with. So it was pretty hard to kill by a lot of the removal. So when they were able to kill it with like an unconditional removal spell, you still kind of had these 0/1s that were able to have gotten you another advantage. So your opponent had something else that they would have to deal with. And just the fact that you were ending up with this giant creature relatively early in the game on turn 4 that was really hard to interact with, like pretty much never could interact with it profitably, just meant that Writhing Chrysalis took over the format and dominated things and just made the Eldrazi deck so powerful. And our final card on this list is Sprout Swarm, a card that absolutely dominated in Future Sight Limited. It's 1 and a green for an instant with Convoke and buyback for 3 mana, and says put a 1/1 green Saproling creature token into play. That might not seem like much. 2 mana to make a 1/1 is just a bad rate, but then when you remember that it has Convoke and buyback, you start to kind of see how this card could be an engine that just fuels itself. Because you make the 1/1 creature token and you buy back the spell, and then that 1/1 creature token can help you convoke out the Sprout Swarm in the future. So then you have the ability to cast Sprout Swarm, bring it back to your hand, use the 1/1s that you're making to cast Sprout Swarm again. And so eventually you're just casting Sprout Swarm purely off of the cards that you have made with Sprout Swarm, because you're just making creatures. Those creatures can help you cast Sprout Swarm again by convoking, and then you just end up in a spot where you just overwhelm the board state with 1/1s through just a single common. And that's just absolutely devastating to have. And it's just the sort of effect that can definitely warp a format, because a lot of decks just can't deal with that. If you're any sort of slow deck that isn't like putting pressure and but making it so your opponents have to like block with their creatures, if you're trying to go to the late game, you just can't really compete with this, because they're just going to eventually make like 10 1/1s or something like that from one card, and you just can't like eventually like spot remove all their cards. And so Sprout Swarm was so good that they tried, when they brought back Future Sight, they tried shifting Sprout Swarm to rare or mythic rare, and they still thought it was too good even in that case, and so they just ended up removing it from the format. So that's kind of an urban legend about Sprout Swarm. It's just an absolutely devastating common and definitely deserves a spot on this list. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. If you made it to the end of the video, leave hashtag super10 in the comment section down below, because these comments are definitely spectacular and super commons in the history of Magic the Gathering Draft. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.